Chapter 4. The blinds of Mrs. Penson's drawing room were drawn down against the oppressive June sun, and in the sultry twilight the faces of her assembled relatives took on a fitting shadow of bereavement. They were all there, Van Elstein's, Stephanie's, and Milson's, even a stray Penson or two, indicating by a greater latitude in dress and manner the fact of remoter relationship and more settled hopes. The Penson side was, in fact, secure in the knowledge that the bulk of Mr. Penson's property went back, while the direct connection hung suspended on the disposal of his widow's private fortune and on the uncertainty of its extent. Jack Stepney, in his new character as the richest nephew, tacitly took the lead, emphasizing his importance by the deeper gloss of his mourning and the subdued authority of his manner, while his wife's bored attitude and frivolous gown proclaimed the heiress's disregard of the insignificant interests at stake. Old Ned Van Alstyne, seated next to her in a coat that made affliction dapper, twirled his white mustache to conceal the eager twitch of his lips, and Grace Stepney, red-nosed and smelling of crape, whispered emotionally to Mrs. Herbert Melson, "I couldn't bear to see the Niagara anywhere else." The rustle of weeds and the quick turning of heads hailed the opening of the door, and Lily Bart appeared, tall and noble in her black dress, with Gertie Farish at her side. The women's faces, as she paused interrogatively on the threshold, were a study in hesitation. One or two made faint motions of recognition, which might have been subdued either by the solemnity of the scene or by the doubt as how far the others meant to go. Mrs. Jack Stepney gave a careless nod, and Grace Stepney, with a sepulchral gesture, indicated a seat at her side. But Lily, ignoring the invitation, as well as Jack Stepney's official attempt to direct her, moved across the room with her smooth, free gait, and seated herself in a chair which seemed to have been purposely placed apart from the others. It was the first time that she had faced her family since her return from Europe 2 weeks earlier, but if she perceived any uncertainty in their welcome, it served only to add a tinge of irony to the unusual composure of her bearing. The shock of dismay with which, on the dock, she had heard from Gertie Farish of Mrs. Penson's sudden death had been mitigated almost at once by the irrepressible thought that now, at last, she would be able to pay her debts. She had looked forward with considerable uneasiness to her first encounter with her aunt. Mrs. Penson had vehemently opposed her niece's departure with the Dorsets, and had marked her continued disapproval by not writing during Lily's absence. The certainty that she had heard of the rupture with the Dorsets made the prospect of the meeting more formidable, and how Lily should have repressed a quick sense of relief at the thought that, instead of undergoing the anticipated ordeal, she had only to enter gracefully on a long-assured inheritance. It had been, in the consecrated phase, always understood that Mrs. Penson was to provide handsomely for her niece, and in the latter's mind the understanding had long since crystallized into fact. "She gets everything, of course. I don't see what we're here for," Mrs. Jack Stepney remarked with careless loudness to Ned Van Alstyne, and the latter's deprecating murmur, "Julia was always a just woman," might have been interpreted as signifying either acquiescence or doubt. "Well, it's only about 400,000, Mrs. Stepney rejoined with a yawn, and Grace Stepney, in the silence produced by the lawyer's preliminary cough, was heard to sob out, "They won't find a towel missing. I went over them with her the very day." Lily, oppressed by the close atmosphere and the stifling odor of fresh morning, felt her attention straying as Miss Penson's lawyer, solemnly erect behind the Bahula table at the end of the room, began to rattle through the preamble of the will. "It's like being in church," she reflected, wondering vaguely where Gwen Stepney had got such an awful hat. Then she noticed how stout Jack had grown. He would soon be almost as plethoric as Herbert Melson, who sat a few feet off, breathing puffily as he leaned his black-gloved hands on his stick. "I wonder why rich people always grow fat. I suppose it's because there's nothing to worry them. If I inherit, I shall have to be careful of my figure," she mused, while the lawyer droned on through a labyrinth of legacies. The servants came first, then a few charitable institutions, then several remoter Melsons and Stepneys who stirred consciously as their names rang out, and then subsided into a state of impassiveness befitting the solemnity of the occasion. Ned Van Elstein, Jack Stepney, and a cousin or two followed, each coupled with a mention of a few thousand. Lily wondered that Grace Stepney was not among them. She had heard her own name. Then she heard her own name. My niece Lily Bart, $10,000. And after that, the lawyer again lost himself in a coil of unintelligible periods, from which the concluding phrase flashed out with startling distinctness. And the residue of my estate to my dear cousin and namesake, Grace Julia Stepney. There was a subdued gasp of surprise, a rapid turning of heads, and a surging of sable figures towards the corner in which Miss Stepney wailed out her sense of unworthiness through a crumpled ball of black-edged handkerchief. Lily stood apart from the general movement, feeling herself for the first time utterly alone. No one looked at her, no one seemed aware of her presence. She was probing the very depths of insignificance. And under her sense of the collective indifference came the acuter pangs of hopes deceived. Disinherited. She had been disinherited. And for Grace Stepney. She met Gertie's lamentable eyes fixed on her in a despairing effort at consolation, and the look brought her to herself. There was something to be done before she left the house, to be done with all the nobility she knew how to put into such a gesture. She advanced to the group about Miss Stepney, and holding out her hand, said simply, "Dear Grace, I am so glad." The other ladies had fallen back at her approach, and a space created itself about her. It widened as she turned to go, and no one advanced to fill it up. She paused a moment, glancing about her, calmly taking the measure of her situation. She heard someone ask a question about the date of the will. She caught a fragment of the lawyer's answer, something about a sudden summons and an earlier instrument. Then the tide of dispersal began to drift past her. Mrs. Jack Stepney and Mrs. Herbert Melson stood on the doorstep, waiting their motor. A sympathizing group escorted Grace Stepney to the cab it was felt to be fitting she should take, though she lived but a street or two away, and Miss Bart and Gertie found themselves almost alone in the purple drawing-room, which more than ever, in its stuffy dimness, resembled a well-kept family vault, in which the last corpse had been decently deposited.